All right, let's get into it. Number 10, the giant griffin. In 1989, classical scholar and paleontologist Adrienne Mayor began cross-referencing ancient Scythian gold artifacts with fossil sites scattered along the Silk Road in Central Asia. What she uncovered would reframe one of antiquity's most enduring mythological creatures entirely. Her research, formalized in her landmark 2000 book published by Princeton University Press, The First Fossil Hunters, proposed something that classical scholars had never seriously considered. The griffin, that fearsome legendary beast with the body of a lion and the wings and head of an eagle, had a skeleton. It had been lying in the Gobi Desert all along. For centuries, the griffin was treated as pure invention, a decorative symbol stamped onto coins and carved into temple friezes across the ancient Mediterranean world. Scholars assumed it was assembled from familiar animals, the way so many mythological creatures were, borrowing parts from creatures the storytellers already knew. The Scythian nomads who traded along Central Asian routes between roughly 675 and 300 BCE were considered imaginative, not observational. Nobody asked what they might have actually seen during those long sun-blasted journeys across the fossil-rich steppes of what is now Mongolia. What Mayor identified was a geographical coincidence too precise to dismiss. The Jadokta Formation in the Gobi Desert, one of the most fossil-productive sites on Earth, sits directly along the ancient trade corridors the Scythians used for centuries. That formation is packed with naturally eroding fossils of Protoceratops, a four-limbed dinosaur roughly 1.8 meters long, with a distinctive large beak, a prominent neck frill, and four powerful clawed legs. No wings, certainly. But examine a naturally exposed Protoceratops skull eroding from desert rock, and the resemblance to griffin descriptions in Herodotus, writing around 440 BCE, becomes genuinely difficult to explain away. Aeschylus described griffins as sharp-beaked, silent watchers guarding gold deposits in the earth. Herodotus placed them in precisely the gold-bearing regions of Central Asia, where Protoceratops fossils are most abundant. The beaked skull, the four-clawed limbs, the discovery of fossils naturally protruding from desert rock without any excavation required. All of it aligns with what a Scythian trader on foot would have encountered and attempted to describe without any framework of paleontology to guide them. The griffin was not assembled from imagination. It was assembled from observation, specifically the observation of a beaked, clawed, four-limbed skull emerging from the earth in the gold fields of Central Asia. If ancient traders were accurate enough to describe a Protoceratops skull in anatomical detail and transmit that description faithfully across centuries, what other creatures did they encounter that we have spent millennia dismissing as fantasy? Number 9. The Lost Cyclops. In 1914, Austrian paleontologist Othenio Abel published a paper that sent a quiet shockwave through the world of classical scholarship. His argument was straightforward and, once stated, almost impossible to unsee. The giant, single-eyed monster at the heart of Greek mythology had a real skull, and that skull had been washing out of Mediterranean island coastlines for thousands of years before anyone understood what it belonged to. The Cyclops was not invented. It was found, examined by people with no knowledge of prehistoric mammals, and described with the tools available to them, which were myth and terror. The islands of the central and eastern Mediterranean, including Cyprus, Malta, Crete, and Sicily, were home during the Pleistocene epoch to populations of dwarf elephants. The species, Palaeoloxodon falconeri, confirmed extensively in fossil deposits, including Gardalam Cave in Malta, stood only around 90 centimeters at the shoulder, a scaled-down island-adapted descendant of much larger mainland relatives that reached 4 full meters. These animals died out thousands of years ago, but their bones did not disappear. They eroded continuously from coastal cliffs and cave systems, presenting themselves to anyone who walked the shoreline and looked down. The critical anatomical detail is one that Abel recognized immediately. An elephant skull, stripped of its trunk by decomposition and viewed without any prior knowledge of elephant anatomy, presents a single, large, central cavity where the nasal passage once was. It dominates the face of the skull. To anyone who had never seen a living elephant, and ancient Greeks had extremely limited exposure to them, that cavity reads unmistakably as a single enormous eye socket. The rest of the skull is massive, robust, and proportioned in a way that suggests a creature of enormous power. Homer's Odyssey, composed around the 8th century BCE, describes Polyphemus as a solitary shepherd living in a cave, enormous, consuming, and possessed of a single central eye. Island caves throughout the Mediterranean are precisely where palaeontologist fossils concentrate most densely. The geographical overlap between where Homer places his Cyclops and where dwarf elephant skulls are found in the greatest abundance is not approximate. It is exact. The Cyclops was never a monster conjured from fear of the dark or the sea. It was a skull washed up on a shoreline, picked up by someone who had never seen an elephant, examined with genuine curiosity, and described with perfect, terrifying honesty. Number 8. The Great Basilisk. Pliny the Elder, writing in his encyclopedic Naturalis Historia, in 77 CE, described the basilisk as a creature of North Africa, a serpentine lizard-like animal whose breath withered vegetation, whose gaze was said to be lethal, and whose approach caused even large animals to flee. He was methodical, not given to careless fantasy, and he placed the basilisk on specific trade routes connecting Rome to the African interior. Researchers mapping Pliny's descriptions against the documented historical range of giant monitor lizards across North Africa and the Mediterranean have found that the overlap is not coincidental. It is systematic. The North African monitor, Varanus griseus, reaches up to 2 meters in length in its largest recorded specimens, moves with unsettling speed, and displays an aggressive territorial response that includes sustained hissing and a raised, threatening posture when confronted by a perceived threat. These are not subtle animals. Larger prehistoric relatives within the Varanus genus provide the true sense of scale. Varanus priscus, known as Megalania, roamed Australia until approximately 40,000 years ago and reached an estimated 5.5 to 7 meters. The biology of giant monitor lizards, in other words, has precedent for producing something genuinely monstrous. What Pliny described as the basilisk's lethal breath maps with reasonable precision onto the bite of a large monitor lizard, which is heavily laden with bacteria and, in some species, venom, and which causes rapid tissue necrosis in prey animals. An ancient observer watching a large monitor kill a goat or a dog without apparent physical force, simply through proximity and a bite that caused the animal to collapse over hours, would have had no framework for bacterial infection. A lethal, invisible exhalation would have been the only rational interpretation available. Medieval basilisk descriptions, consistently originating from scholars drawing on North African and Near Eastern trade account sources, maintained these same core characteristics across more than 1,000 years of transmission. The crown-like marking described in later medieval accounts may incorporate observations of the king cobra, Ophiophagus hanna, whose hood displays a marking that genuinely resembles a diadem. The basilisk, in other words, may be a composite of 2 real animals, both terrifying, both documented by witnesses who described exactly what they saw. When medieval scholars wrote that the basilisk's gaze could kill, were they transmitting superstition, or were they faithfully recording the testimony of witnesses who watched a massive monitor lizard paralyze its prey with venom and sheer physical presence and had no language except legend to pass that knowledge forward? Number 8. The Great Basilisk. Pliny the Elder, writing in his Naturalis Historia, in 77 CE, described the basilisk as a creature of the North African interior, a large serpentine lizard whose breath was lethal, whose gaze caused prey to collapse, and whose range followed specific trade routes connecting Rome to the African continent. Pliny was methodical. He separated reliable accounts from fantasy throughout his work, and he placed the basilisk in a specific geography. Researchers who have since mapped his descriptions against the confirmed historical range of giant monitor lizards across North Africa and the Mediterranean have found the correspondence is not vague. It is precise and repeatable. The North African monitor, Varanus griseus, reaches up to 2 meters in its largest confirmed specimens, moves with remarkable speed, and responds to perceived threats with sustained hissing and an aggressive raised body posture that has startled experienced naturalists in the modern era. Its larger prehistoric relative, Varanus priscus, known as Megalania, roamed Australia until approximately 40,000 years ago and reached an estimated 5.5 to 7 meters in length. The Varanus genus, in other words, has well-documented biological capacity for producing something a Roman naturalist might describe as monstrous. What Pliny called the basilisk's lethal breath corresponds with reasonable anatomical accuracy to the documented effects of a large monitor's bite. Monitor saliva is heavily colonized with pathogenic bacteria, and several species have been confirmed to deliver venom. Prey bitten by a large monitor and released will often die hours later from tissue necrosis and systemic infection, with no visible wound severe enough to explain the death. An ancient observer watching this sequence had no framework for bacterial infection. An invisible, lethal exhalation was the only rational interpretation available to them. Medieval basilisk descriptions, drawn consistently from North African and Near Eastern trade route accounts, preserved these core characteristics across more than 1,000 years of transmission. The crown marking attributed to the basilisk in later medieval accounts may incorporate separate observations of the king cobra, Ophiophagus hanna, Iarnidals, whose distinctive hood genuinely resembles a diadem. This suggests the basilisk may be a composite creature assembled from direct encounters with two real animals, both formidable, both documented by witnesses who recorded precisely what they observed. When medieval scholars transcribed that the basilisk's gaze alone could kill, were they preserving superstition or faithfully recording the accounts of witnesses who watched a massive, venomous lizard fell its prey invisibly and reached for the only language they had to explain what they could not understand? Number 7. The Sea Kraken. On November 30th, 1861, the French naval corvette Alecton encountered something in the open Atlantic that brought her crew to a standstill. The officers filed a formal report with the Académie des Sciences in Paris, describing a vast, many-armed creature of reddish-brown color, floating at the surface with a body mass they estimated at 2 tons. Their account was received with considerable skepticism. For the next 143 years, the creature they described, which matched in almost every particular the kraken of Norse maritime tradition, remained officially unconfirmed, a thing that sailors swore to and scientists doubted. The kraken entered the formal written record in 1752, when Eric Pontoppidan, the Bishop of Bergen, included a systematic account of it in his Natural History of Norway. Pontoppidan was careful to distinguish between folklore embellishment and consistent eyewitness testimony from Norwegian fishermen. He described an animal of enormous size that surfaced from deep water, sometimes beneath small vessels, with multiple long arms. The descriptions he collected were consistent across different fishermen in different locations, and he treated them as evidence of a real animal rather than a legend. He was ignored for the better part of 2 centuries. On September 30th, 2004, marine biologist Tsunemi Kubodera of the National Science Museum of Japan and Kyoichi Mori photographed a living Architeuthis ducks, the giant squid, in the wild for the first time in recorded history. The animal was captured on camera at 900 meters depth off the Ogasawara Islands. It measured several meters across its tentacles alone. The mantle, the main body of the animal, reaches up to 2.25 meters in confirmed specimens, and the total length of a full-grown Archaeologists reaches 13 meters. The creature the Alacton's crew had described was real. It had simply been living far below the depth of 19th century observation technology. In 2007, researchers confirmed the existence of the colossal squid, Mesonychoteuthis hamiltoni, reaching up to 14 meters in estimated maximum length, making it the largest invertebrate animal confirmed on Earth. Sucker scars on sperm whale skin, documented by whalers since the 17th century, had long suggested the existence of an animal large enough to fight a whale. Every piece of physical evidence the ocean offered across 3 centuries pointed toward the same conclusion that Pontoppidan reached in 1752. The kraken was dismissed as myth for so long that when it finally surfaced before a camera lens in 2004, it almost seemed as though the ocean had simply grown tired of waiting to be believed. Number 6. The giant serpent. In February 2009, paleontologist Jason Head of the University of Toronto and his international team published findings in Nature that forced an immediate reassessment of the biological limits of snake body size. The fossil they had excavated from the Cerrejón coal mine in the La Guajira department of northern Colombia was not from any snake alive in the modern world. It was not close to any snake alive in the modern world. What they had found in the Cerrejón Formation, in rock layers dated to approximately 58 to 60 million years ago, was a predator of such extraordinary scale that naming it required reaching into mythology. Titanoboa caerrejonensis was formally described from vertebrae measuring approximately 30 centimeters in diameter. Body size in snakes can be calculated by scaling vertebrae against those of living relatives, and when Head's team ran those calculations, the results were unambiguous. Titanoboa reached an estimated length of between 12.8 and 14.3 meters. Its estimated weight was approximately 1,135 kilograms, making it heavier than a modern dairy cow and longer than a city transit bus. It was the apex predator of its Paleocene ecosystem, a world of vast tropical swamps and enormous prey animals, and nothing in its environment was beyond its reach. Ancient Colombian and Amazonian cosmologies feature world serpent figures of immense power at the center of their creation accounts. The Yurupari tradition of Amazonian peoples describes a primordial serpent whose body forms the rivers of the world. Further north, the feathered serpent traditions of Mesoamerica, including the figure of Quetzalcoatl, preserve a deep cultural memory of serpentine creatures of supernatural size and authority. These mythological frameworks do not require a direct encounter with Titanoboa itself, which had been extinct for tens of millions of years before any human walked the Americas. But they suggest a persistent cultural recognition that the largest serpents were something categorically apart. What makes Titanoboa significant beyond its sheer dimensions is what its existence tells us about the thermal history of the Earth. For a cold-blooded animal to reach that body mass, equatorial temperatures during the Paleocene would have had to be significantly higher than today, approximately 30 to 34 degrees Celsius in average air temperature. The fossil is, simultaneously, the record of a monster and a thermometer for an ancient climate. The Cerrejón mine, a working coal operation, continues to yield fossils from this period, and researchers return to it regularly. If a snake weighing over a ton lived in South America's geologically recent past, surviving in river systems and wetlands that still exist in modified form today, what is the probability that isolated populations persisted long enough for the first human inhabitants of those regions to encounter one and carry the memory forward in exactly the way mythology always has? Number 5. The Ancient Minotaur. In 1900, British archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans arrived at Knossos on the island of Crete and began excavating what would become one of the most significant sites in the history of archaeology. What emerged from the earth over the following decades was not simply a palace. It was a labyrinth, a genuine, sprawling, multi-story complex of over 1,300 interconnected rooms, corridors, light wells, and ritual chambers, covering an area of approximately 13,000 square meters, built by a civilization Evans named Minoan after the mythological king Minos himself. The structure that ancient Greek mythology had always described as the home of a monstrous bull-headed man turned out to exist precisely where legend said it would. The Minoan civilization flourished between approximately 2700 and 1100 BCE, and bull imagery saturates every layer of its material culture. Frescoes dating to around 1500 BCE, excavated from Knossos Palace itself, depict athletes leaping over the backs of living aurochs, Bos primigenius, the wild ancestor of domestic cattle. The aurochs was not a symbolic animal. It was a real and terrifying one. Adult males stood 1.8 meters at the shoulder, weighed up to 1,000 kilograms, and carried horns that curved outward to lethal effect. These animals were not placid. They were the largest and most dangerous land animals in the ancient Mediterranean, and the Minoans were ritually engaging with them inside a building deliberately designed to disorient. The physical evidence for violence at Knossos extends beyond frescoes. In 1979, archaeologist Peter Warren excavated skeletal remains from a deposit within the palace that showed trauma patterns consistent with deliberate killing. That same year, Yannis Sakellarakas uncovered the Anemospilia sanctuary site near Knossos, revealing skeletal evidence interpreted by most researchers as indicating ritual human sacrifice during a seismic emergency around 1700 BCE. People were being killed at or near this labyrinthine complex. They were being killed in proximity to bull cult ritual activity. The mythology of the Minotaur maps onto this archaeology with an accuracy that is difficult to attribute to coincidence. The structure existed. The bull cult existed. The ritual killing existed. What the myth added was a narrative framework, the monster at the center, the tribute of young men and women, the hero with a sword that transformed a set of documented religious practices into a story that traveled across 3,000 years intact. The Minotaur was real in every way that mattered, a beast of crushing power, a maze of stone, and human beings sent inside it, knowing that most would not return. Number 4. The Desert Manticore. Ctesias of Cnidus was not a fabulist. He was a trained Greek physician who served at the Persian royal court of Artaxerxes II around 400 BCE, and his work, Indica, a systematic account of the natural world of India and Persia compiled from Persian royal records and first-hand accounts, was treated as a serious geographical source by ancient scholars for centuries. When Ctesias described the manticore, he was specific in a way that fantasy does not require. He described a lion-bodied predator from the Indian subcontinent with a human-like face, 3 rows of interlocking teeth arranged front to back, and a tail tipped with venomous spines. That dentition detail, 3 rows of teeth, is not decorative. It is observational. The saber-toothed cats of the genus Meganterion and Machairodus ranged from Africa through the Levant and Persia and into South and Central Asia throughout the Pliocene and into the Pleistocene between roughly 5 million and 1 million years ago. Their fossils are abundant in the Siwalik Hills deposits of what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, one of the richest Pliocene fossil sites in the world. Fossil hunters working those deposits throughout the 20th century have recovered jaw fragments and partial skulls in remarkable states of preservation. Meganterion's jaw, when examined from above or the front, presents a visible layering of incisors, elongated saber canines, and heavy rear carnassial teeth, 3 visually distinct rows of dentition. A physician trained in careful anatomical observation shown a Meganterion skull by Persian court officials who had received it via trade from India, would have done exactly what Ctesias did. He would have counted and described what he saw. 3 rows of interlocking teeth is a precise, accurate, non-specialist description of a saber-toothed jaw. The rest of the manticore's description, the lion body, the powerful limbs, the tail, reflects the general morphology of a large felid predator accurately enough. The human-like face is the only significant departure, and facial pareidolia, the human tendency to read faces into things, is well documented and predictable. Theseus was mocked for centuries after his death for reporting the manticore as a real animal. But a Greek physician in the Persian royal court had access to objects, specimens, and accounts from across the known world. Persian trade networks extended deep into India, and the Siwalik beds yield fossils so naturally and so abundantly that no formal excavation was required to encounter them. If Ctesias had a saber-toothed skull placed in front of him and described it with the anatomical precision of a trained physician, what exactly was he supposed to call it? Number 3. The rock bird. The genus Epiornis, the elephant bird of Madagascar, was formally named in 1851 by French naturalist Etienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire from bone fragments recovered on the island's southern coast. Over the decades that followed, researchers pieced together an increasingly extraordinary picture of what this animal had been. Epiornis maximus. The largest confirmed species stood up to 3 meters tall and weighed an estimated 730 kilograms, making it the heaviest bird ever confirmed to have existed. Its egg, the largest of any known animal, reached up to 34 centimeters in length, with a volume approximately 160 times that of a chicken egg. Entire eggs, intact and petrified, continue to be found eroding from Madagascan coastal sediment today. Arab sailors and traders had been operating along the East African coast and reaching Madagascar via the Indian Ocean Trade Network since at least the 8th century CE. The geographer Al-Biruni, writing around 1000 CE, referenced the rock in the context of Indian Ocean navigation, placing it in a region consistent with Madagascar and the surrounding island chains. Marco Polo, in his Il Milioni of 1298 CE, described the rock as inhabiting islands far to the south of India and as capable of lifting an elephant, a description that, while obviously exaggerated by the mathematics of avian biology, nonetheless preserves the core observation of an enormous flightless bird encountered on a large southern island. In 2018, researchers at the Zoological Society of London confirmed a closely related species, Vorumbe titan, as the largest bird ever to have lived on Earth, exceeding even Epiornis maximus in estimated body mass. The word Vorumbe in Malagasy means simply big bird, which suggests that local populations maintained a living memory of the creature long after its extinction. Critically, A. Epiornis maximus is now estimated to have survived until approximately 1000 to 1200 CE in most of its range, with some evidence suggesting isolated populations persisted into the 1600s. Arab sailors trading along Madagascan coastlines between 800 and 1200 CE were therefore contemporaries of living elephant birds. These were not sailors who encountered bones. They encountered the animal itself, moving along beaches and through the coastal vegetation of Madagascar, and they described what they saw. The rock passed into Arabic and Persian literary tradition through the same mechanism that all reliable natural history travels: repeated, consistent eyewitness testimony from multiple independent sources across a specific geography. The rock was not a myth carried on imagination. It was a memory carried on trade winds, the last echo of an encounter between human sailors and the largest bird that ever walked the earth. Number 2. The ancient Leviathan. On a date in 2008 that would quietly become one of the most significant in the history of paleontology, a fossil hunter prospecting the Cerro Colorado Badlands in the Ica region of southern Peru noticed something unusual eroding from the pale sediment of the Pisco Formation. The skull fragment was enormous, clearly cetacean, clearly unlike anything in the published record. It was brought to the attention of paleontologist Olivier Lambert of the Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Sciences and the international team that subsequently excavated and described the specimen published their findings in Nature in July 2010. They named the animal Leviathan melvillei, after the biblical sea monster and the author of Moby Dick, because no other names seemed adequate. The Pisco Formation sediment encasing the skull was dated to approximately 12 to 13 million years ago, placing the animal firmly in the Miocene epoch. What Lambert's team had found was a predatory sperm whale, unlike any living species, with a skull measuring approximately 3 meters in length and an estimated total body length of between 13.5 and 17.5 meters. These figures alone are extraordinary. What distinguished Leviathan from every other whale in the fossil record were its teeth. The largest confirmed examples measured up to 36 centimeters in length, making them the largest functional teeth of any known animal in the history of life on Earth. Not display structures, not filter apparatus, weapons used actively to prey on other large whales. The Leviathan appears in the Book of Job, composed somewhere between the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, described as a creature of the sea, whose power is beyond challenge, whose body is armored, and whose breath sets coals ablaze. The same entity appears in Ugaritic mythology from around 1400 BCE, where it is named Leton, a multi-headed sea serpent of primordial force. These traditions did not originate in the Pisco Desert, but coastlines erode. The same geological processes that presented the Leviathan skull to a Peruvian fossil hunter in 2008 were operating along ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern coastlines across the entire span of human civilization. A coastal community in the ancient Levant that discovered a 3-meter sperm whale skull with 36-centimeter teeth eroding from a seaside cliff had no paleontological framework to contain what they were looking at. They had theology, cosmology, and oral tradition. They reached for the most powerful language available to them, and what they produced was Leviathan, a creature whose description has never quite lost the quality of something remembered rather than invented. What emerged from the Pisco Formation in 2008 was not simply a fossil. It was the answer to a question the ancient world had been asking for 3,000 years, preserved in stone, waiting for someone to look in the right desert. Number 1. The Thunderbird. In 1887, Argentinian paleontologist Florentino Ameghino formally described fossil bones recovered from Patagonian deposits belonging to a flightless predatory bird so anatomically formidable that the scientific community required years to fully process what it represented. The creature was a member of Phorusrhacidae, a family of carnivorous birds that dominated South America as apex predators for over 60 million years, from the Paleocene through to the end of the Pleistocene. They did not go quietly. The most recent confirmed North American representative, Titanus walleri, survived in the fossil record of Florida and Texas until approximately 1.8 million years ago, a date that places its extinction uncomfortably close to the earliest confirmed evidence of human presence in the Western Hemisphere. Kelenken guillermois, the largest confirmed terror bird species, was described in 2007 by a team led by paleontologist Luis Chiappi of the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County. Its skull measured 71 centimeters in length, the largest bird skull ever confirmed from any species in Earth's fossil record. Its estimated standing height reached approximately 3 meters. It moved on legs built for sustained pursuit and killed with a hooked beak designed to deliver a single, precise, downward strike to the skull of prey animals the size of a horse. Kelenken was not a scavenger. It was an engineered killing machine, and it operated in ecosystems that, in modified form, still exist across the Americas today. Thunderbird traditions are documented across more than 40 distinct indigenous North American nations, including the Lakota, Ojibwe, Kwakwaka'wakw, and Haida peoples, spanning thousands of miles of geographic separation, with no documented historical contact sufficient to explain the consistency of their accounts. Every tradition describes the same core entity: a bird of exceptional size, a predator associated with power, storm, and the capacity to carry large prey. These are not vague, interchangeable mythological motifs. They are specific, repeatable, anatomically coherent descriptions of a large predatory bird embedded in the oral traditions of nations whose ancestors arrived in North America during the same geological window in which terror birds were still alive. Human presence in North America was confirmed at 14th and 300 years before present by Dennis Jenkins and his team at the University of Oregon, based on coprolite evidence from Paisley Caves in Oregon, published in Science in 2008. Titanus walleri survived in North America until approximately 1.8 million years ago, and some researchers have proposed that isolated South American populations of related species may have persisted far more recently in remote regions where the fossil record remains incomplete. The temporal gap between the two is real, but not as absolute as it once appeared, and oral traditions have been demonstrated across multiple cultures to preserve accurate information about geological and biological events across thousands of years of transmission. Mythology did not create the Thunderbird. The Thunderbird created the mythology, and it did so by being exactly what 40 nations across an entire continent described: real, enormous, primordial, and standing directly in front of the people who would remember it forever. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.